36 times. That's how many times steel flashed in the air before anyone in the room could even scream. It happened inside a packed Harlem restaurant on a Friday night in the summer of 1935. 200 people, musicians, couples on dates, waiters moving between tables, the low hum of conversation mixed with jazz drifting through the room. The kind of place where nobody expected violence, especially not the kind that would freeze an entire neighborhood in fear. At first, most people didn't understand what they were seeing. A chair scraped backward, a glass shattered. Then came the sound no one forgets, the sharp, wet rhythm of a blade finding flesh again and again. By the time people realized this wasn't a bar fight, it was already over. A man lay broken on the floor, bleeding, blind, alive only because the one standing over him had decided he was finished. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And this wasn't random. This wasn't pride or temper or bad luck colliding in a crowded room. This was a contract, a paid execution meant to happen in public, sent by one of the most dangerous mob bosses in New York. The message was supposed to be simple. Harlem was no longer his. Everyone in that restaurant was meant to witness Bumpy Johnson die. Instead, they witnessed something far worse for the Mafia. Because after the last strike, after the screaming stopped and the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like pressure in the chest, Bumpy Johnson did something no one could explain. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't even look at the man on the floor. He stood up slowly, straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie like a man preparing for a business meeting. Then, without a single glance backward, he stepped over the body as if it were nothing more than a puddle on the floor. He returned to his table, pulled out his chair, and sat down calmly while 200 witnesses watched, unable to move. Moments later, with blood still fresh on the tiles and fear still hanging in the air, Bumpy Johnson raised his hand and called for the waiter. His voice was steady, polite. He said he was hungry. That single act, ordering food after surviving a public assassination attempt, spread through Harlem faster than any bullet ever could. By morning, every numbers runner, every mob lieutenant, every boss from the Bronx to Brooklyn had heard the story. Not just that a hit failed, but how it failed. And that raised a question the Mafia couldn't ignore. What kind of man survives a contract killing in front of 200 people and makes the entire underworld retreat without firing a single shot? By 1935, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an economy, a culture, and a battleground. Every street corner had eyes, every storefront had a story, and every dollar that moved through the community mattered. The biggest engine driving all of it was the numbers racket, an illegal lottery where nickels and dimes from working people stacked into millions every week. Whoever controlled those numbers controlled Harlem's lifeblood. For years, that control belonged to a woman most outsiders underestimated, Stephanie St. Clair. Smart, relentless, and fearless, she built the numbers empire from nothing and defended it with lawsuits, bribes, and strategy. But when legal pressure wasn't enough, she needed muscle. Not reckless muscle. Precision, discipline. Someone who understood that violence wasn't about chaos, it was about control. That man was Bumpy Johnson. By his early 30s, Bumpy had already earned a reputation that traveled faster than his name. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. He dressed sharp, spoke calmly, quoted poetry, and played chess. But when trouble came into Harlem, he handled it personally. People said Bumpy didn't look for fights, he finished them. And when he made a promise, especially to protect Harlem, he kept it. That promise put him directly in the path of Dutch Schultz. Schultz controlled large warnings of New York's underworld and wanted Harlem's numbers, money badly, not part of it, all of it. He sent crews north, confident that fear alone would make people fall in line. Instead, his men didn't come back. One by one, they were beaten, chased out, or carried away. Harlem wasn't reacting, it was resisting. So Schultz escalated. He didn't want quiet pressure anymore. He wanted a spectacle. A killing so public, so brutal, that every numbers runner in Harlem would understand resistance was useless. That's when he reached outside New York and hired a man known for one thing, finishing jobs loudly. And Bumpy knew it was coming. Harlem talked. Shoeshine boys, flower sellers, porters, bartenders, people most mob bosses never noticed, fed information upward. Bumpy learned who had arrived in town, where he was staying, and why he was there. He knew the man was watching him. He knew the plan wasn't subtle. And he knew if guns came out in a crowded room, innocent people would die. Still, Bumpy didn't cancel his plans. That Friday night he walked into the restaurant looking like any other well-dressed gentleman. He wasn't there to hunt, he was there on a date. Across the table sat a woman who saw Harlem through words and art instead of fear. The jazz played, drinks were poured. For a moment everything felt normal. But when the door opened and the hitman stepped inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The hunter had arrived, and Bumpy Johnson was already waiting. The man Dutch Schultz sent didn't waste time hiding. That was part of the message. He wanted to be seen, big, scarred, confident, moving through the restaurant like he owned it. He didn't rush. He didn't whisper. He let people feel him coming. This was supposed to be an execution carried out in front of witnesses, not in an alley. Bumpy noticed the shift immediately, the way conversations dipped, the way bodies stiffened, the way instinct told everyone something bad had just walked through the door. He clocked the man's posture, the way his shoulders sat, the way his jacket pulled slightly under the arm. That told him everything he needed to know. Gun on one side, blade on the other. A professional. The hitman stopped at Bumpy's table and spoke just loud enough for nearby diners to hear. He said Bumpy's name. He mentioned Dutch Schultz. He made it clear why he was there. This wasn't personal. It was business. Harlem was being warned. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He didn't threaten. He answered calmly, almost politely, like two men discussing weather instead of death. But while the hitman talked, Bumpy watched one thing only: the man's hand, the slight drift of it toward his jacket, the moment where words would turn into bullets. That's when Bumpy made the choice that changed everything. If a gun came out, the room would explode. Innocent people would get hit. The music, the waiters, the woman sitting across from him, none of them mattered to a bullet. So Bumpy decided there would be no gunfire at all. He moved first, not toward the man's chest, not toward his face. His hand went to the table, to the steak knife resting beside his plate. One clean motion, no hesitation, no warning. The blade flashed upward before the hitman could finish reaching for his weapon. What followed didn't look like a fight. It looked like inevitability. Bumpy came out of his chair with terrifying speed. The first strike disarmed the gun before it cleared the jacket. Metal hit the floor. The second strike opened flesh. The third took balance. Tables tipped. Glass shattered. People screamed and scrambled back, but no one dared step in. The hitman was bigger, stronger, known for violence. None of it mattered. Every move he made was already answered before it finished. Bumpy slipped punches, closed distance, and cut with precision that felt practiced, almost surgical. This wasn't anger. This was control. By the time the man collapsed, the message was already delivered. Harlem didn't belong to outsiders, and Bumpy Johnson was not a man you surprised. The room went silent as the blade stopped moving. 200 people stood frozen, watching, waiting for what came next. Because everyone understood one thing in that moment. What happened after the violence mattered more than the violence itself. The restaurant didn't erupt after it ended. It froze. Music stopped mid-note. Glasses hung half-raised in the air. No one spoke. No one moved. 200 people stared at the same image, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The hitman lay on the floor, broken and finished. Alive, but defeated in a way that went far beyond pain. Not one shot had been fired. Not a single innocent person had been touched. And Bumpy Johnson stood over him, breathing steady. Then he did the thing that sealed the moment into Harlem legend. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, not quickly, not nervously, calmly, deliberately, as if he were correcting something small before returning to his seat at a meeting. The gesture sent a chill through the room that violence never could. It said this wasn't chaos, this was order. Bumpy stepped over the man on the floor without a glance, walked back to his table, picked up his chair, sat down. Only then did people realize how quiet it was. The woman across from him hadn't moved. Her face showed shock, but also something else, disbelief. She had been talking poetry and music minutes earlier. Now she was watching a man wipe his hands with a napkin like he'd spilled a drink. Bumpy looked up at the room, not with anger, not with pride, with calm authority. Then he called for the waiter. His voice didn't shake. He asked for food. That was the moment that broke everyone's understanding of power. Not the fight, not the speed, but the control afterward. The absolute refusal to be rattled. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a loss of control, it was enforcement. By the time police arrived, the story had already taken shape in people's minds. They didn't see a brawl. They saw a warning delivered cleanly, publicly, and without panic. And somewhere across the city, men who believed fear ruled Harlem were about to realize they had miscalculated badly. By the next morning, Harlem was already buzzing. Not about the blood, not even about the blade. What people talked about was the calm, the tie, the food order. That detail traveled faster than the facts because it told everyone the same thing. This wasn't desperation. This was certainty. When the story reached Dutch Schultz, it landed like a punch he couldn't block. The man he'd paid to make an example of Bumpy Johnson hadn't just failed. He'd been dismantled in front of a room full of witnesses. Worse than that, he'd proven Schultz's biggest mistake. Harlem wasn't afraid. Schultz had thrown men at the neighborhood for months, dozens, and still Bumpy wasn't hiding. He wasn't fleeing. He was sitting down to eat. That forced a decision. Keep pushing and lose more men, or step back and rethink everything. Schultz chose the second option. Within months, conversations shifted from threats to negotiations. Guns were replaced with sit-downs. The idea that Harlem could be taken by force quietly died that night in a restaurant full of stunned witnesses. Years later, people would argue about the exact number of cuts. Some swore it was fewer, others swore it was more, but everyone agreed on what mattered. That was the night Harlem drew a line. Bumpy Johnson went on to become something larger than a feared enforcer. He became a symbol, a man who showed that real power wasn't noise or rage, it was control under pressure, the ability to act decisively and then return to calm as if nothing had happened. That's why his name was spoken carefully, why deals replaced violence, why the Mafia learned to negotiate instead of invade. Because once people see you can destroy a threat and then sit down to finish your meal, they understand something simple. You don't need to say it twice. And that's how one public moment turned a contract hit into a warning and made the entire mob back off Harlem.